Last month, I released a video in which we explored many of the most famous real Kabuto samurai helmets, worn by some of Japan's most iconic warriors during the height of warfare in medieval Japan. In that video, I said I would be later coming back to talk more about some of the most bizarre helmets we know about, which is exactly what we are going to be doing here today. But if you haven't watched the first video, I very much recommend watching it before you watch this one, because I go into a little bit more detail regarding samurai helmet history and structure in that video than I will be going here. Previously, we examined such helmets as that of Kato Kiyomasa's, Fukushima Masanori's, Ii Naomasa's, Honda Tarakatsu's, Naoe Kanetsugu's, and a few more. However, here in this video, which will be sort of a part 2, we are going to be turning away from the more epic looking Kabuto to instead take a look at some of the more wacky and strange helmets. Just like in the last video, the helmets I'm going to examine were actually real helmet designs that we still have around today in museums or perhaps even in private collections. So we will once again be steering clear of any false romanticized designs, the types that often show up in films and video games and sadly have little to no basis in reality. Now, the clear thing I want to get across here in terms of a point to this video is really just to show off some of these rather unorthodox designs, and if I can, explain in detail what they are meant to represent and why. Because as you may have seen from the first video, there is a lengthy meaning behind almost everything in terms of a samurai helmet's design and ornamentation. Remember that samurai often really try to personify their personality with their helmets, really making for some very unique, artistic, and beautiful designs, alongside that of some really strange ones too, at least by today's standards. But before we go any further into examining some of these rather odd helmets, I need to mention once again that this video, just like the last one, is being done in partnership with channels such as Samurai and Ninja History and Sengoku Studies, who too have been recently making videos talking about medieval Japanese helmets and ornamentation in great depth. These are great channels producing great content to really help flesh out a ton regarding not only this subject but also so much more relating to the history of warfare in medieval Japan. Down below, I'm going to be leaving some links to their videos on samurai headwear. Please go check them out in accompaniment to this one. And with that said, let's dive in and begin to look at some of these rather odd Kabuto. Now, just like in the first video, most of the helmets we are going to examine here were worn by significant figures who fought at the Battle of Sekigahara in the year 1600. However, there are going to be a number of other helmets I'm going to be mentioning as well, and ones that were even made during the Edo period. But to start off, let's begin by examining the strange helmets of the Kuroda family, where we can not only find one very odd Kabuto, but actually two, both of which worn by father and son Kuroda Yoshitaka and Kuroda Nagamasa. Let's start with Yoshitaka, who will be the oldest person of those that I will be talking about here today. His odd choice he made for his Kabuto came in looking like this. As you can see, it resembles an upside-down red cup, which is exactly what it was. Kuroda Yoshitaka, also known as Kanbei or Josui, was one of Toyotomi Hideyoshi's top strategists and also a devout Christian. As for why this helmet shape, well, there are a couple different suggestions I found regarding why it was used, with one of the more common legends simply saying that he was a lover of tea ceremonies, and perhaps wishing to display his attachment to its elegant and honorable tradition, decided that this was to be the look of his armor that he would wear, and that possibly the helmet could symbolize him drinking up the enemy. Obviously, I don't think he intended it to strike any real fear into the hearts of his enemies, but surely his foes would likely come to question Yoshitaka's skills and capabilities for anyone to wear such a daring style. But if you thought wearing a cup on your head was odd, let's look at his son Nagamasa, who wore what looks like a shovel. No, it was not actually meant to represent a shovel, but rather the slope of a mountain. This design is often referred to as the Ichi no Tani Kabuto, which was meant to symbolize the slope of the mountainside that Minamoto Yoshitsune came down during the Battle of Ichi no Tani during the Genpei War hundreds of years prior, making the helmet design really a callback to a great triumph within the legends of samurai history. But something that perhaps is even more fascinating is the idea that this helmet design actually first belonged to Fukushima Masanori and not Kuroda Nagamasa. If we remember back to the first helmet video, I discussed Fukushima Masanori's brilliant golden horned Kabuto. Well, it appears that this helmet may have actually originally belonged to Nagamasa, while the Ichi no Tani Kabuto was Masanori's. Both men had fought together during the Imjin War, the samurai invasion of Korea, and would later also fight together at the Battle of Sekigahara. The story goes that perhaps some point, likely prior to the Battle of Sekigahara, as a token of friendship, they exchanged copies of their helmet designs, and thus would forever be recognized by these two distinctive helmets. Truly a fascinating little historical detail, if it is in fact true. Yet, moving on, another rather interesting design can be seen in that of Hosokawa Tadaoki. Tadaoki's helmet is one that is characterized by its unique usage of feathers and fur, as rather long feathers almost just erupt out of the center of the scalp, while to the rear, fur adorns the sides and back. This particular helmet design appears to be in the Tsunari style, which you can tell by its smoothness. However, Tadaoki surely made it his own and would have been an easily identifiable figure on the battlefield. And I will say one thing about Tadaoki's design, is that although it is wacky, it doesn't strike me as impractical at all, because the feathers would have obviously been lightweight and there would have been no issue with mobility, which makes it contrast all the more heavily to the next design that I want to look at, this being the helmet worn by Toro Takatora. Toro Takatora's helmet is a very strange one, and one of the most unique helmets that I have ever come across. The actual shape of it is believed to perhaps represent the shape of a Chinese crown. Likely it appears from the Tang dynasty. But in addition to the shape, what you obviously see right away are the massive ears that jut out from both sides. I am not entirely sure what the purpose of the ears were on this particular helmet. And it should be noted that ears on samurai helmets in general were not the most unheard of thing, but I've never really seen ears to this huge scale. Rabbit ears upon samurai helmets likely have their roots in something esoteric, but this design makes them almost appear as a completely impractical element to the Kabuto itself. Yet, by the time Takatora would have been wearing this helmet, he probably would not be anywhere near the actual fighting during a battle. You see, Takatora is someone like that of Hideyoshi, who started off his military career as an Ashigaru foot soldier, yet who was able to rise through the ranks until eventually becoming a full-fledged samurai. Luckily, all before Hideyoshi banned such class fluidity. He would go on to become one of the commanding figures during the Imjin War, and would of course later be at the Battle of Sekigahara. His increased role as a military leader would have meant, like others I have talked about here so far, that he would not have been in the middle of the actual battle, but rather off commanding troops. And it is in that role in which a helmet like this would make much more sense. Because realistically, there is absolutely no way anyone could really be able to effectively fight wearing something so obstructive. Now, with that said, these four Kabuto were really the ones I wanted to focus on here today. Not only because of how they belong to famous figures, but also because they are indeed believed to be real and accurate. However, there are three more that I want to mention really quick before we move on to look at some of the designs that would come about during the Edo period. These three designs are that of Mori Yoshinari, whose Kabuto looked like a large dagger just shooting straight up, the Mount Fuji inspired look of Kato Yoshiaki's Kabuto, and of course that of Maeda Toshinaga, whose helmet was in the same eboshi style we looked at in the first video, but to a much larger extent. Almost too large. And once again, I am choosing to highlight these here because we do have what appears to be real authentic versions of them held in museums or private collections today. Not to mention the fact that importantly, they are recognizable and easy to attach to the correct historical figure. There are of course many more very strange ones out there that we see during the Sengoku Jidai. And if I did not mention one that you had in mind, please mention it in the comments below. But with that said, the last helmets here that I want to show off are, I believe, to be mostly made during the Edo period and are harder to assess. Plenty of these look much more like stunning works of art rather than real legitimate helmets. I imagine they were likely more used as status symbols and prized possessions that a samurai would place within his residence. As by the Edo period, since peace now reigned across Japan, helmets no longer really needed to be practical, and thus artisans were free to really be more creative with their designs. There were helmets made to resemble fish, squids, dragonflies, seashells, and of course a wide array of different land animals. These are definitely the most bizarre of all the Kabuto we have looked at today, but the reason I separate them is the fact that they likely would not have been used to any real combat purpose, and like I said, would have just served as elaborate decor. However, and this is the thing to watch out for, there were a ton of helmets made during the Edo period that often get linked, many times falsely, to real historical figures. Helmets which historians today argue the authenticity of, yet which creates a difficult situation for samurai we have little to no other designs for. Keep in mind, popular myths of what a lot of samurai are believed to have worn have their birthplace in the Edo period. Such is the case for samurai like Oda Nobunaga, Takeda Shingen, and maybe even a lot of what we see from Uesugi Kenshin, which then makes it hard for us today to really know what is real and what is romanticized. Whatever the case, the Kabuto I have shown off here today are real examples of some of the strangest designs that would have come about during the later years of the Sengoku Jidai, and just go to help illustrate the wide variety of ways in which samurai would decorate themselves to not only stand out, but also show off their own personality. If you want to learn more about samurai helmets and headwear, please go check out my first video on this subject if you haven't already. In fact, like I said, you probably should have done that to begin with. But also, don't forget to check out videos from Samurai and Ninja History and Sengoku Studies, all of which you can find linked below. I highly recommend it. And with that said, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.